This segment of Secrets to Fishing is brought to you by Brewer Agri Outdoors.
It's finally that time of year again, where springtime is opening up all the lakes and rivers to get ready for an open water bite. Which means you gotta make sure your rods and reels are ready to catch fish. Regardless if it's a spinning reel, bait casting reel, or a spin cast reel, here's a few things I go over with my equipment to make sure it's ready to catch fish this spring when Mother Nature lets me hit the water. First, I'm going to do a quick look over on the external parts of the reel. You're going to make sure that the reel seat isn't cracked or damaged, and then make sure your reel handle's good and aligned and that nothing's up with the bail or the spool itself. That looks pretty good. And then next, I'm just going to listen for any dirt noise. Yeah, that one sounds pretty good. Let's take a look at this one. Oh, there's a lot of noise there. Yep. Yeah, that's a lot of noise. Let's open this one up first and take a look. First thing I want to do is lay down a towel, make sure nothing greasy gets on the table. Then just start taking the reel apart. Oh man, there's a lot of dirt here. So the first thing you can do with these is just take the whole assembly off the shell. So there's not a whole lot with these spin cast reels to grease and oil because they're pretty bulletproof in that regard, but I'm just going to start taking a toothbrush to this and getting all that grime and sand off. So once you think you got all the dirt and sand out of your reel, you just take a paper towel and start wiping it down. Get some of the wet stuff from the sand and dirt that'll mix with the grease. If you have to, don't be afraid to rinse your reels under some water. Just make sure you give it ample time to dry once you do that. And another way to get some dirt out in some of those hard to reach places is canned air, or just use an air compressor attachment. Once this is all dry and ready to go, we'll put some more line on and put it all back together and put her back on the rod to go fish. Now, when we first looked at this, it didn't sound like there was any dirt or sand inside of it, but it is a little stiff from what it normally should be. So I'm just going to show you how I take a spinning reel apart and fix that problem. So the first thing is you just twist your spool drag knob until it completely comes off, and then your spool line will come off. And then there's a whole bunch of gears and bearings inside of here, so make sure none of these fly out and disappear on the floor forever. And then you just take these little parts off. The one thing I always do when taking a reel apart is I set the individual pieces that come off just in a nice even line, keeping the order so I can put it back together with ease, not struggle and have to look it up on the internet. So once I got these first components taken apart, what I'm going to do next is start taking apart. There's a nut here and a screw that looks like it's a flathead. So I'm going to take that screw out first. Next part is there's that nut right along the shaft here. So we got to get a wrench, and crescent wrenches work pretty well for this. And just gently twist that off. There you go. Once you break it free, it's just super easy to take it off with your fingers. Now this is that little piece that was connected to that screw, holding it all together. And now that whole reel assembly come off right there. So this is your bail right there. Let's set that in line here. So now we're in the guts of the reel, where all the bearings and all the reel part happens. So I'm just going to grab the reel oil and put a drop right by that bearing here, and then down the spindle hole. You don't need a whole lot. Just keep on moving. Make sure you put everything back together and align it all right. That looks good. So one thing you got to make sure that you don't do is over tighten screws. Just make sure that the screws and nuts are all nice and snug and that everything lines up correctly. Put your pieces back together. Feel a lot better there. All right, on to the next one. Now when it comes to bait casters, the place that you're going to find most of the dirt and sand is in the spool itself. And with most bait casters, you just flip a small switch on the bottom side of the reel, take out this door, and the whole spool will come right out of the reel. And this one seemed to be working completely fine, so there's really no point in taking the whole thing apart and looking it over. I'm just going to do a quick glance of the spool. That looks pretty good. And the inside of the door here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the spool in a little bit here first and put just one small drop of oil into the main gear assembly. Now that I got that spool back in, it's just as simple as pushing that door back in and flipping that lever, and we're all good to go. And then another place on bait casters to check is the spool drag, this knob here. And then what gets a lot of anglers in trouble is the actual handle itself, because sometimes the nut will come loose. And I've experienced the whole handle flying off while I'm fishing. So just make sure that's good and tight. Doesn't seem to be moving too much at all. Yep. This one seems to be good working order. I'm just going to put some new line on it, put it back on my rod, ready to go. Now let's take a look at fishing line. When it comes to spin casting reels, a lot of people put heavy line on in hopes that it'll last, but these reels tend to be used with kids for pan fishing more often. So what we like to do is use 6 to 8 pound mono and then replace it a few times throughout the summer, because it's a lot easier to cut through a spool of mono than it is a bunch of braid. Next, when it comes to monofilament, we like to replace it every spring, because when it's sitting throughout the winter, freezing and thawing constantly, it becomes very brittle, which can be tough to cast on a spinning reel. And then it also develops line memory, which can be very frustrating. And then when it comes to braid, what we like to do with our reels is just strip 8 to 10 feet off the spool, feeling for any nicks or frays, and then any spot that feels or looks chalky. And if you're not sure about the braid, the one thing you can do is reverse the line onto another reel. So the front part of this line becomes the backing on this second reel. And then finally, you can just replace the line altogether. When it comes to putting line on your spool, with monofilament, you can just go ahead and tie it on and go. But with braid, there's a couple things you gotta look for. If your reels don't have tie-off locations for braid, a couple things you can do is simply put a piece of electrical tape around the spool, or put a couple layers of monofilament backing on so the braid doesn't slip around the spool. Now the last thing you got to do, put your rods and reels together, rig them up the way you want to fish, and when you hit the water, you know your reels won't let you down.